Story 1 ***, The Last Passenger ***. Nighttime in Vancouver has its own rhythm. A city of whispers and shadows. Beneath the glow of streetlights and the soft crunch of snow, there exists a world where the ordinary collides with the unexplainable. For Jack, a veteran taxi driver, the night held no surprises, or so he thought. He had heard the stories before. Urban legends of strange passengers, ghostly figures, and cursed destinations. But Jack was a practical man. He dismissed them as tales told to entertain or frighten. After all, the only thing haunting the streets at 2 a.m., as far as he was concerned, were the drunks, the lonely, and the lost. That belief would shatter on a cold winter night under a heavy blanket of snow, when Jack picked up a fare that was far from ordinary. Jack was cruising down a deserted street, his wipers swiping rhythmically against the falling snow. The world outside was silent, save for the occasional crunch of tires over fresh powder. The digital clock on his dashboard read 1:58 a.m. Almost time to call it a night. He had just been thinking about heading home when the taxi radio beeped, signaling a new job, a request from a narrow alley near the industrial district, a place Jack usually avoided this late. It was too quiet, too isolated. But business had been slow, and he needed the money. After hesitating for a moment, he sighed, adjusted his gloves, and made a U-turn toward the pickup point. The alley was dark, illuminated only by a single flickering streetlight. Jack's headlights cut through the snow, revealing a solitary figure standing motionless beneath the dim glow. It was a woman. She was slender, draped in a long black coat that nearly touched the ground. Her hair, dark and wet with snow, clung to her face, obscuring her features. Jack pulled up, his unease growing with every second. He rolled down the window, the cold air biting at his skin. "Need a ride?" The woman turned her head slowly, her pale face emerging from the shadows. Her eyes, deep and dark, locked onto his with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "To Blackwood Cemetery," she said, her voice low and rasping, as if carried on a winter wind. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Blackwood Cemetery was abandoned, overrun by time and neglect, and no one in their right mind would go there at this hour. Yet something about her gaze, cold and unyielding, compelled him to nod. "All right," he muttered, unlocking the doors. The woman stepped into the back seat without a word, and as the door shut, a chill seemed to envelop the entire car. From the moment she entered his cab, Jack felt the atmosphere shift. The air grew heavier, colder, and the faint scent of earth and decay lingered. Trying to shake off his discomfort, he started the engine and headed toward the cemetery. The drive was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the heater and the sound of snow crunching under the tires. Jack stole glances at the rearview mirror, but every time he did, the woman's eyes seemed to meet his. "Kind of late to be heading to a cemetery," Jack said, forcing a chuckle to break the silence. "It's been abandoned for years, hasn't it?" She didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the window, as if watching something only she could see. The snowfall grew heavier, and soon, a dense fog began to roll in, swallowing the road ahead. Jack slowed the car, squinting to navigate through the whiteness. "This is it," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They had arrived at Blackwood Cemetery. Jack hesitated as he peered through the fog. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, rusted and slightly ajar, their sharp edges barely visible under the thick snow. Beyond the gates, rows of headstones jutted out like jagged teeth from the frozen ground, half consumed by the swirling mist. "This doesn't look like a place anyone should be visiting," Jack muttered under his breath. He turned in his seat to address the woman, but she was already opening the door. She stepped out silently, her black coat trailing in the snow, and began walking toward the gates without so much as a glance back. "Wait," Jack called out. "You sure you don't want me to stick around? It's freezing out here." The woman didn't answer. Her figure melted into the mist, leaving Jack alone in the suffocating quiet of the night. He sighed and glanced at the meter. The ride was logged, but something gnawed at him. A sense of unfinished business. Shaking his head, he reached over to reset the meter when his eyes caught something odd. On the back seat lay a photograph. Jack froze. The photo seemed impossibly out of place, like it didn't belong in his cab or in this time. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. It was an old black and white picture, its edges frayed with age. In the photo was a young woman with long, dark hair, her pale face framed by a faint, unsettling smile. She was wearing a coat identical to the one the passenger had worn. Underneath the photo were handwritten words. Anna Carter born, 1902, died, 1931. Jack's stomach churned. His thoughts raced. The name, the date, none of it made sense. His passenger couldn't possibly have been. A loud knock on the window shattered his thoughts. Jack jumped, dropping the photo. He whipped his head around, but there was no one outside, just the empty road and the fog. His breathing quickened. "All right, Jack, get a grip," he muttered to himself, reaching for the ignition. But before he could turn the key, the radio crackled to life. "You can't leave yet." The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably female. Jack's heart pounded as the voice dissolved into static, followed by a deep, guttural laugh that filled the cabin. "Nope, I'm done." Jack slammed the gear shift into reverse, desperate to leave the cemetery behind. The taxi tore down the icy road, its tires barely gripping the snow. Jack's hands clutched the wheel as he whispered a silent prayer. He glanced at the rearview mirror, something he regretted instantly. There she was. The woman was sitting in the back seat again, her dark eyes locked onto his. But this time, her face was no longer pale. It was gaunt, sunken, her skin gray and cracked like old stone. Her lips curled into a malevolent smile. Jack screamed and jerked the wheel. The car skidded violently, spinning out of control. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle veered off the road and slammed into a snowbank. When Jack came to, his head throbbed, and the car's engine sputtered before dying. His breath fogged up the shattered windshield as he looked around, disoriented. The road was empty. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a stretch of trees dusted in snow. The back seat was empty. Relief washed over him, though his body was still trembling. He fumbled for his phone, but before he could dial, a faint tapping echoed from the back window. He turned, every nerve in his body screaming at him not to. There she was, standing just outside the car, her face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes peering directly into his soul. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Jack screamed again, kicking the door open and stumbling out into the snow. He didn't stop to look back. He ran as fast as his legs would carry him, the icy air burning his lungs. The aftermath. Jack never returned to the taxi business after that night. The authorities found his abandoned cab the next morning, but there was no trace of the woman, nor the photograph. Jack would later learn that Anna Carter had been a real person, one who had died tragically near Blackwood Cemetery almost a century ago. Rumors of her ghost haunting the area were well known among locals, though most dismissed them as mere folklore. For Jack, however, it was no legend. He knew the truth. Some passengers aren't looking for a ride. They're looking for something else entirely. And in the quiet, snow-covered streets of Vancouver, His story became a cautionary tale among night drivers. Never pick up a lone passenger at 2 a.m. near Blackwood Cemetery, they would say, because you might not make it back. Story 2: The Midnight Passenger. Mark Bennett had been a night shift taxi driver in Seattle for nearly 8 years. He was no stranger to the city's nocturnal secrets. Its quiet streets, the drunken laughter spilling out of bars, and the occasional odd passenger with a strange story. But nothing could have prepared him for the chilling encounter that awaited him one foggy November night. It began like any other shift. Mark had parked near a 24-hour diner, sipping a lukewarm coffee while checking his phone. The taxi app chimed, notifying him of a new fare. The pickup location made him pause. Ravenwood intersection, a desolate area on the outskirts of the city, notorious for eerie rumors and ghost stories. Mark hesitated. Ravenwood was known as a haunted spot, a place where urban legends were born. Decades ago, a school bus carrying students had skidded off the road and plunged into a ravine. Since then, locals claimed to see shadowy figures roaming the area, seeking rides to nowhere. Shaking off his unease, Mark accepted the fare. "It's just another passenger," he muttered, starting the engine. The streets grew narrower and darker as he approached the pickup point. A dense fog enveloped the road, muting even the distant hum of the city. Under a flickering street lamp, he spotted her. A young woman in a pale dress, standing motionless. Her long dark hair obscured most of her face, and she clutched a small bag tightly to her chest. Mark rolled down the window. "Did you call for a taxi?" She nodded silently and got into the back seat without saying a word. As she settled in, a strange chill filled the car, making Mark shiver. "Where to?" he asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. *** Blackwater Bridge ***, she replied softly. Her voice was almost a whisper, barely audible. Mark frowned. The bridge was a derelict structure that spanned a remote river. No one had much reason to go there, especially not in the dead of night. "You sure? It's not a safe place at this hour," he said, hoping she might reconsider. She didn't respond, only stared out the window at the fog-covered trees. Mark sighed and began driving. The journey was eerily quiet. The radio crackled faintly, but no station would come through. Mark felt an inexplicable tension in the air, as though the night itself was watching them. "You live near the bridge?" he ventured, trying to make conversation. "I have to say goodbye," she murmured. Her words sent a chill down his spine. He glanced at her in the mirror, but her expression was blank, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. When they reached Blackwater Bridge, Mark slowed the car. The bridge loomed out of the fog like a ghostly skeleton, its rusted beams creaking faintly in the wind. "This is it," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. She opened the door and stepped out. Mark watched as she walked toward the bridge, her bag still clutched tightly. "Wait," he called. "Are you sure you're okay?" She paused at the bridge's edge and turned to face him. For the first time, he saw her face clearly under the dim light. Her eyes were sunken, her skin unnaturally pale, and her expression void of emotion. "Thank you for the ride," she said. Before Mark could respond, she stepped off the bridge and vanished into the mist below. A chilling discovery. Panicked, Mark jumped out of the car and ran to the edge, but there was no sign of her. No splash, no sound, nothing but the impenetrable fog and the eerie stillness of the night. As he turned back toward his taxi, he noticed something on the ground near where she had stood. A small leather bag. Picking it up with trembling hands, he opened it to find a photograph of a young woman smiling brightly. The face in the photo was unmistakable. It was her. But what froze Mark's blood was the writing scrawled on the back of the picture. Emily Grayson, 1932-1955. Mark stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Summoning every ounce of courage, he climbed back into his car and sped away from the bridge. The next morning, Mark couldn't shake the events of the previous night. He did some digging and discovered that Emily Grayson was one of the victims of the bus accident at Ravenwood decades ago. Her body had never been recovered, and local legends claimed her spirit wandered the area, searching for closure. Mark never took another fare near Ravenwood or Blackwater Bridge. But even now, on quiet nights, he sometimes feels an unnatural chill in his taxi. Like someone or something is sitting silently in the back seat, waiting for their final destination. Story 3: The Ghost Taxi. In the cold drizzle cloaking the quiet alleys of New York, whispers of eerie tales often fill the air. One of the most spine-chilling stories is about a ghost taxi. A black sedan roaming the deserted streets at midnight, picking up unfortunate passengers on a one-way journey to the unknown. No one knows where it comes from, but those who step inside are said to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only chilling rumors throughout the city. David Reynolds, a 35-year-old office worker, never believed in such stories. To him, ghosts were just tales meant to scare children. But one late night, after working overtime in Manhattan, his life took a turn he could never have imagined. That night, the subway was down due to a technical malfunction, and David's ride-hailing app failed to find a driver. The drizzle turned heavier, clinging coldly to his coat as he wandered through empty streets, illuminated only by pale streetlights and the sound of rain tapping on the pavement. As he desperately searched for a way home to Brooklyn, he spotted a black taxi parked under a street lamp. The car was shiny but strangely old, as if it had just rolled out of an old movie reel. "Finally," David muttered, hurrying toward the car. When his hand touched the door handle, a shiver ran down his spine, but he dismissed the unease. The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged driver seated behind the wheel. His face was pale, his deep-set eyes resembling two voids that seemed to swallow light. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice low and emotionless. "Brooklyn, near Evergreen Street. Please," David replied hesitantly. The driver gave a slight nod without saying another word. David climbed into the back seat, shutting the door behind him. At first, the route seemed familiar, but it wasn't long before everything outside the window turned strange. Familiar buildings faded away, replaced by narrow, shadowy roads flanked by skeletal trees. The streetlights grew sparse, and a thick fog began to engulf the surroundings. David's discomfort grew. He glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the driver's empty, unwavering gaze fixed straight ahead. "This isn't the way to Brooklyn," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're heading to where you need to be," the driver replied in a cold, detached tone. David stiffened. "No, this isn't right. Stop the car now." The driver didn't respond, his hands gripping the wheel with unnatural stillness. The car engine emitted a strange, low rumble, as if struggling to move on an unearthly road. Outside, the scenery had morphed into something out of a nightmare. It was no longer New York, but a desolate wasteland shrouded in darkness and fog. The trees lining the road were gnarled and bare, their branches resembling skeletal hands clawing at the void. Panic seized David. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He banged on the window, shouting, "Let me out! I want to get off this car." The driver finally turned his head, and David froze in terror. The man's face had transformed. His skin waxy and deathly pale, his eyes now empty sockets of pitch-black darkness. "You boarded the car. There's no turning back now," the driver said, his voice resonating with an otherworldly echo. The taxi suddenly accelerated, tearing through the fog as if heading into another realm. David felt gravity slipping away, and the world around him seemed to twist and distort. Soft whispers and chilling laughter filled the air, though it was clear he was the only passenger. When the taxi finally screeched to a halt, David was thrown forward. Looking out the window, he realized with growing dread that they had arrived at an ancient graveyard. Crooked tombstones jutted out from the earth beneath the pale moonlight, casting long, ominous shadows. The driver turned around once more, his face now a grotesque mask of death, and smiled faintly. "Your journey ends here." The door creaked open on its own, and an invisible force yanked David out of the car. He fell to the ground, his screams caught in his throat as shadows from the graveyard stretched toward him, wrapping around his body like cold, lifeless hands. ### a haunting legacy. The next morning, a group of pedestrians stumbled upon an old black taxi parked by the curb in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. The car was empty, but the back seat was damp, as if someone had just been sitting there. Inside the car, they found a work ID. The name on it read David Reynolds, a man who had been reported missing days earlier. Since then, whispers of the ghost taxi have persisted. On rainy nights, some claim to see the black sedan roaming the streets, waiting for weary, desperate passengers. And those who step inside may find themselves on a journey with no return, their fate forever tied to the mysterious, cursed taxi of the night.